Renowned for, Mr. Speaker, we do not support this legislation.
Call Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak on the Land Transport Management Amendment Bill, and I do have quite a lot to say about this bill. I'll start by saying that it's really a shame that the government is missing this incredible opportunity that we have in transport policy to achieve the goals that they say they want to achieve, which are economic productivity. And we have the opportunity to build a consensus really across the Parliament to achieve what all New Zealanders really want from their transport system. But unfortunately, as was well articulated by David Bennett, this government is stuck in the past. They're stuck 30 years ago. He said that he was so happy that finally the Waikato region was going to be getting the Waikato Expressway, a project they'd been advocating for 30 years. And I think that speaks volumes about where the government is placed in terms of their transport thinking. They are stuck in the past. The Green Party will not be supporting this bill. Not because everything in the bill is bad. Some things are arguably quite good. But when you take it in the context of the current evidence-free transport policy and priorities, the changes that this bill makes could allow some monumentally bad projects to go ahead. And that is firstly because the bill allows for additional borrowing to pay for transport infrastructure. And it allows for borrowing over and above covering cash flow. So at a time when the government is arguing that we need to sell strategic assets that are providing a healthy return in order to supposedly pay down debt, the same government is gearing up to borrow billions to pay for uneconomic motorways. It's really tragically ironic that they are going to be borrowing to pay for motorways that will not even deliver the economic development that they say they want. Now, the idea that the cost of infrastructure with long-lasting intergenerational benefits could be spread over the years through borrowing is not a terrible idea in and of itself. However, this government is prioritizing very bad state highway projects that simply don't make economic sense, and they certainly won't substantially benefit future generations. So in this context, borrowing is extremely dangerous. It's going to saddle future generations with debt for projects that they won't even benefit from. The proposed legislation also opens the doors to public-private partnerships. And really, this is just a backdoor way of borrowing. It's a way of getting, it's definitely still borrowing, but it's keeping that debt off the government books in the short term. But I think that when we look overseas at examples of public-private partnerships, particularly with respect to transport infrastructure, what we find is that they're extremely damaging for the public sector, and they're extremely costly for the taxpayer. So, we compiled this research on Australian PPP roading projects, which should be highly relevant to the government's plan to use PPPs to fund some of their roads of so-called significance. And here's just one example. The Clem 7 tunnel in Queensland. The initial forecast cost was $1.2 billion. The actual cost was $3 billion. The traffic forecast at opening was 60,000 vehicles. The actual traffic during a lower toll period, this is the peak, was 34,000 vehicles. That's about half of what was forecast. The forecast for 2012, this year, was 100,000 vehicles, and if you can believe it, the number of vehicles using this project had fallen even further to 28,000. So it's about a quarter of what was forecast to use the project. Now, if you look at all of these Australian PPP roading projects over the last few years, you will see that they're all basically debacles. And if you look at the literature from Europe as well, you see consistently that there's an over-prediction of the benefits of roading projects through PPPs and toll roads in particular. And the reason for this is actually really understandable. It's because the entire methodology that we've used in our transport planning for the past 50 years or more is actually biased towards cars. It overestimates the benefit of improvements that allow more vehicles to flow through an area, and it underestimates the cost. So if we look at the actual evidence, then what we can understand in a way that really the National Party should be able to understand is that there are a large number of market distortions in our transport network, and that's led to an extremely unbalanced transport system that in the case of New Zealand is very, very costly. And it's going to become even more costly as we face rising fuel prices. So we have the opportunity to do things differently, to spend less money and to achieve the transport outcomes we want, the efficiency and the effectiveness. We have the opportunity to reduce congestion, spending less money, investing more in trains and buses. And I'm really sorry that David Bennett isn't here, because I think that if he actually looked at the numbers... excuse me. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Previous speaker, David Bennett, mentioned that public transport, the reality of public transport was that people didn't take it and it required huge subsidies. But I think that he's not actually looked at the numbers, because in Auckland, for example, public transport patronage has been growing extremely fast, and patronage on the rail network in particular is almost 30% higher than what was modeled by the Auckland ART2 model, which is the public transport four-stage model. It models demand for public transport and road projects. So at this point in time, when the government is arguing that we need to reduce debt, at the same time, they're taking the exact opposite approach to transport infrastructure. And there couldn't be a more opportune time to actually reduce the amount of money that we're spending on transport infrastructure and make it smarter, make it more effective and more targeted. There were a few interesting observations in the board paper that went to the NZTA about PPPs, which is quite relevant to this bill, as this bill is going to allow PPPs, and now we see that the NZTA is actually already preparing a business case for PPPs for certain roading projects. And one of them was that Transmission Gully obviously isn't a good option for a PPP, even though the government has been talking about it being an option. And the reason it's not a good option for a PPP is because it doesn't have a good business case. And every government analysis of that motorway project has shown that there simply isn't the demand to justify the tolls that would be needed to pay for the project. So what does that tell you? It tells you that actually the project isn't economically viable. And going to the private sector isn't going to make a not economically viable project viable. All it's going to do is take the risk and put it onto the public. And actually, we've seen in the model of PPPs that the government is actually investigating does exactly that. It's called the availability payment model, which means that tolls go to the government, and the government pays the private companies an annual payment for building and maintaining the road. This model puts all the risk of low patronage on the government, on the taxpayer, which we've seen in Australia and in Europe consistently. Toll roads have less patronage and lower revenue than what was forecast in the business model. So all the Green Party is asking for, really, is some economic rationality and evidence to be applied to transport policy in a way that really the government should be quite open to. And I'd be quite happy to sit down with them and help them, because I know that I have more expertise in this area than they do. And I'm really interested in working with them, because I genuinely believe that government members are going to live to see the day that these projects, that everyone in New Zealand realizes that these projects were a terrible waste of taxpayers' money. And they're going to regret ever supporting them. They will be like the motorways in Greece, which are completely empty and which cost billions of dollars and did nothing to create economic growth. And that's very understandable, because once you have an existing road network, the benefits of replacing or duplicating a link are diminishing as time goes on. If you were putting a brand new link in where there was no road before, maybe there would be some economic benefits, but there's already roads between Auckland and Hamilton. There's already roads between Puhoi and Wellsford. And the marginal cost of duplicating that road is enormous, and the benefit is so tiny because it's only a few minutes saved. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to conclude by saying the Green Party will not be supporting this bill until such time that the government can demonstrate that they're capable of an economically rational transport policy. Thank you.
Call Jamie Lee Ross.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to speak on this bill. Mr. Speaker, I think it's a bill which will